The starving stallion refused to stop pawing at the cracked desert earth until Samuel finally dug where the horse demanded and found a human skeleton, its bony fingers still clawing toward the surface. For 20 years, no one would buy this cursed ranch, and now he understood exactly why. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The desert wind howled across the barren landscape of West Texas, carrying with it the dust of 1,000 forgotten dreams. For 20 long years, the Hadley Ranch had stood abandoned, its weathered boards and rusted windmill serving as a silent monument to something nobody in the nearby town of Dry Creek wanted to discuss. Real estate agents had tried countless times to sell the property, but every potential buyer who visited seemed to leave with the same haunted expression, muttering excuses about the land being too dry, too remote, too cursed. The truth was something far stranger, something that the old-timers whispered about only after several drinks at the local saloon, and even then, they spoke in hushed tones, as if the very walls might be listening. Samuel Thornton was not a man who believed in curses or ghost stories. At 53 years old, he had spent his entire career as a geologist, working for oil companies across the Southwest, and if there was one thing his profession had taught him, it was that the earth held secrets far more valuable than any superstition could explain. When he heard about the Hadley Ranch being available for a fraction of its actual worth, his scientific mind immediately began calculating the possibilities. The property sat on nearly 500 acres of land that had never been properly surveyed, and Samuel knew from experience that West Texas soil often concealed riches that the untrained eye could never perceive. The day Samuel first drove onto the property, the sun hung low and orange on the horizon, casting long shadows across the cracked earth. His truck kicked up clouds of dust as he navigated the dirt road that led to the main house, a structure that seemed to sag under the weight of its own abandonment. The windmill creaked mournfully in the breeze, its blades turning slowly, as if powered by memories rather than wind. Samuel stepped out of his vehicle and surveyed the land around him, noting the way the ground rose and fell in subtle formations that spoke volumes to someone who knew how to read them. The real estate agent, a nervous young man named Timothy who had driven separately, approached Samuel with papers clutched tightly in his hands. His eyes darted around the property as if expecting something to jump out at any moment, and his voice trembled slightly when he spoke. "Mr. Thornton, I have to be honest with you. Nobody has lived here since old Walter Hadley disappeared back in 2005. The police searched for months but never found any trace of him. Some folks say he just wandered off into the desert and died, but others believe something more sinister happened." Samuel listened to the young man's words with half an ear, more interested in the geological features of the land than in local legends about missing ranchers. What caught Samuel's attention most was a slight depression in the earth about 200 yards from the main house, a subtle sinking that most people would dismiss as natural erosion, but that his trained eye recognized as something potentially significant. He walked toward it, ignoring Timothy's protests about staying near the house until the paperwork was complete. The depression was roughly circular, perhaps 30 feet in diameter, and the soil within it appeared darker than the surrounding desert floor. Samuel knelt down and grabbed a handful of the earth, letting it sift through his fingers as he analyzed its composition. There was moisture here, deep below the surface, and moisture in the desert meant only one thing. There was something beneath this land worth discovering. Samuel signed the papers that very evening, purchasing the Hadley Ranch for less than what most people paid for a modest home in the city. Timothy seemed relieved to be rid of the property, practically sprinting back to his car once the documents were completed and notarized. As the young man's taillights disappeared down the dusty road, Samuel stood alone on the porch of his new home, listening to the coyotes beginning their nightly chorus somewhere in the distant hills. He felt no fear, only anticipation for what the coming weeks might reveal about this mysterious piece of land that nobody else had wanted. The first 3 weeks on the property were spent making the house habitable and surveying the land with his professional equipment. Samuel mapped every acre, taking soil samples and using ground-penetrating radar to create a picture of what lay beneath the surface. The results confirmed his initial suspicions. There were significant underground cavities and formations that suggested either natural water sources or something else entirely, something that would require excavation to properly identify. He ordered drilling equipment from a supplier in Houston and settled into a routine of early mornings and late nights, his excitement growing with each new piece of data he collected. It was during his 4th week on the ranch that everything changed. Samuel had just finished breakfast and was preparing to head out to the depression site when he noticed something moving near the old barn at the edge of the property. At first he thought it might be a coyote or a stray dog, but as he watched, the figure emerged more clearly into the morning light. It was a horse, a stallion, whose chestnut coat was caked with dust, and whose ribs protruded sharply beneath skin that seemed stretched too thin across its frame. The animal moved slowly, its head hanging low, and when it reached the water trough that Samuel had filled the night before, it drank with the desperate thirst of a creature that had been wandering the desert for far too long. Samuel approached carefully, not wanting to startle the clearly exhausted animal. The stallion lifted its head and regarded him with eyes that seemed to hold an intelligence beyond what Samuel expected from any horse. There was something in that gaze, something almost pleading, as if the animal was trying to communicate a message that words could never convey. Samuel spent the next hour feeding the stallion and cleaning the worst of the dust from its coat, speaking to it in low, soothing tones. By noon, the horse had gained enough strength to stand without trembling, and it began following Samuel around the property like a faithful dog, rather than a wild creature that had wandered in from the desert. Little did Samuel know that this starving stallion would become his guide to the greatest discovery of his life, and the key to solving a mystery that had haunted Dry Creek for 2 decades. Samuel named the stallion Ranger, a name that seemed fitting for a horse that had clearly traveled great distances across the unforgiving desert terrain. Over the following days, a bond formed between man and animal that Samuel could not quite explain. Ranger seemed to possess an uncanny awareness of his surroundings, often stopping mid-stride to stare at particular spots on the property with an intensity that made the hair on Samuel's arms stand on end. At first, Samuel dismissed these behaviors as the quirks of a traumatized animal, still recovering from whatever ordeal had left him wandering alone in the wilderness. But as time passed, he began to notice a pattern emerging from Ranger's strange fascinations. The stallion kept returning to the same location, the circular depression that Samuel had identified during his first day on the property. Each morning, before Samuel had even finished his coffee, Ranger would trot over to that spot and stand there, pawing at the ground with increasing urgency. The horse would dig shallow holes with his hooves, snorting and whinnying as if frustrated by his inability to penetrate deeper into the earth. Samuel watched these displays with growing curiosity, his scientific mind wrestling with the possibility that the animal somehow sensed something beneath the surface that even his sophisticated equipment had not fully revealed. One morning, Samuel decided to follow Ranger's instincts quite literally. He brought his portable drilling rig to the exact spot where the stallion had been digging and set up the equipment, while Ranger watched with what could only be described as approval. The horse stood nearby, calm and attentive, as if supervising a project he had been waiting years to see completed. Samuel felt slightly foolish taking direction from a horse, but his career had taught him that sometimes the most valuable discoveries came from the most unexpected sources. He activated the drill and began boring into the earth, expecting to hit the water table he had detected with his radar scans. What he found instead defied all his expectations. At approximately 15 feet below the surface, the drill broke through into a hollow space, causing the equipment to lurch suddenly forward. Samuel cut the power immediately and peered down into the hole he had created, using a flashlight to illuminate the darkness below. The beam revealed not a natural cavern or an underground spring, but something far more extraordinary. The corner of what appeared to be a wooden structure, buried beneath 2 decades of accumulated soil and debris. His heart pounding with excitement and apprehension, Samuel spent the rest of the day carefully widening the hole, working with the patience that his profession demanded, while fighting the urge to tear through the earth with his bare hands. By sunset, he had exposed enough of the underground structure to identify it as some kind of cellar or bunker, its wooden walls surprisingly well preserved despite the years of burial. Ranger stood at the edge of the excavation site throughout the entire process, occasionally leaning his head down toward the hole and breathing deeply, as if drinking in a scent that carried memories Samuel could not access. The stallion's behavior had shifted from agitation to something resembling anticipation, his dark eyes reflecting the fading sunlight as they stared into the depths below. Samuel knew he should wait until morning to explore further, knew that descending into an unknown underground space at night without proper safety measures was the kind of reckless behavior that got people killed in remote locations. But something about the way Ranger was watching him, something about the weight of 20 years of mystery pressing down on this forgotten piece of land, made caution feel like cowardice. He retrieved a rope from his truck, secured it to a fence post, and lowered himself into the darkness. The cellar was larger than he had expected, roughly 20 feet by 30 feet, with earthen walls reinforced by the wooden beams he had seen from above. His flashlight swept across the space, revealing shelves lined with dusty jars, old tools hanging from hooks, and furniture covered with moth-eaten canvas tarps. It was clearly a storage space, perhaps a storm shelter that the previous owner had constructed, but Samuel sensed there was more to discover. He moved deeper into the cellar, his boots crunching on debris that had fallen through cracks in the ceiling over the years. That was when his flashlight beam fell upon the corner of the room, and Samuel Thornton experienced a moment of pure, primal horror that would haunt his dreams for years to come. There, partially buried beneath collapsed earth and rotted wood, lay human remains. The skeleton was positioned in a way that suggested the person had been trying to dig their way out, their bony fingers still extended toward the ceiling as if reaching for a salvation that never came. Around the skeleton's neck hung a tarnished chain with a small leather pouch attached, and scattered nearby were objects that time had not yet managed to destroy: a wallet, a rusted pocket knife, and what appeared to be a leather satchel. Samuel's hands trembled as he approached the remains, his scientific training battling against the visceral revulsion that threatened to send him scrambling back up the rope. He forced himself to examine the scene objectively, noting the position of the bones, the state of decomposition, and the personal effects that might help identify the unfortunate soul who had died in this underground tomb. The wallet, when he carefully opened it, contained a driver's license so faded that the photograph was barely visible, but the name was still legible: Walter James Hadley. Samuel had found the missing rancher, and judging by the position of the body, Walter Hadley had not wandered off into the desert to die. He had been trapped down here, buried alive in his own cellar. Above ground, Ranger let out a long, mournful whinny that echoed across the desert landscape. Samuel looked up toward the circle of starlight visible through the hole he had created, and for the first time since arriving at this cursed property, he understood that he had stumbled into something far more complex than a simple geological survey. Walter Hadley had been murdered, his body hidden in a place no one thought to look, and somehow this starving stallion had led Samuel directly to the evidence that would finally reveal the truth. The question that now burned in his mind was one that he knew would consume him until he found the answer. Who had buried Walter Hadley alive, and why had they gone to such lengths to ensure his body would never be found? Samuel did not sleep that night. He sat on the porch of the old ranch house with Ranger standing nearby, the stallion seeming to understand that his human companion needed the comfort of his presence. The desert air had turned cold, as it always did after sunset, but Samuel barely noticed the chill seeping through his jacket. His mind was consumed with questions that spiraled endlessly through his thoughts, each one leading to another that seemed even more troubling than the last. Walter Hadley had been a rancher, a man who had lived alone on this property for nearly 30 years before his disappearance. What could he possibly have done to deserve such a terrible fate, trapped beneath the earth in his own cellar, left to die in the darkness while the world above searched for him in all the wrong places? When the first light of dawn began painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, Samuel made his decision. He would contact the authorities and report his discovery, but first he needed to document everything he had found. His geological training had taught him the importance of preserving evidence, and something told him that whoever had buried Walter Hadley had been clever enough to cover their tracks in ways that might not survive official investigation. He retrieved his camera from the truck and descended once more into the cellar, this time with the clear morning light filtering down through the hole to supplement his flashlight. The photographs he took that morning would later become crucial evidence in the investigation that followed, but in the moment, Samuel was more interested in understanding the story the scene was telling. Walter Hadley had clearly survived for some time after being trapped, long enough to attempt digging his way out through the ceiling. The scratch marks on the wooden beams above the skeleton showed where fingernails had torn against the grain, desperate and futile. Near the body, Samuel found empty water jars and the remnants of food containers, suggesting that whoever had imprisoned Walter had perhaps intended for him to survive, at least for a while. This was not a quick murder, but a prolonged torture, a death sentence carried out with patience and cruelty. The leather satchel proved to be the most significant discovery. Unlike the wallet and other personal effects, it had been positioned beneath Walter's body, as if he had been trying to protect it, even in death. Samuel carefully extracted it from the debris and carried it up into the daylight, where Ranger immediately approached and began sniffing at it with intense interest. Inside the satchel, Samuel found a collection of documents that had been remarkably preserved by the dry desert climate and the protective leather exterior. There were land surveys, mineral rights certificates, and geological reports that predated Samuel's own work by several decades. But most importantly, there was a handwritten letter, its ink faded but still legible, addressed to someone named Eleanor. The letter revealed a story that Samuel had not anticipated. Walter Hadley had discovered something on his property in the summer of 2004, something so valuable that he had hired private geologists to confirm his suspicions. The reports in the satchel indicated the presence of significant oil deposits beneath the ranch, deposits that conservative estimates valued at several $100 million. Walter had been preparing to sell the mineral rights to a major energy company, a deal that would have made him one of the wealthiest men in West Texas. But someone had learned of his discovery before the deal could be completed. Someone who wanted those riches for themselves. Samuel read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new details that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. Walter had written to Eleanor, apparently his sister living in California, expressing fears about his business partner, a man named Theodore Brennan, who had been helping him navigate the complex process of selling mineral rights. Walter suspected that Theodore was planning to cheat him out of his fair share, possibly by forging documents that would transfer ownership of the property before the sale could be finalized. The letter ended with a chilling statement. "If anything happens to me, look beneath the windmill." Walter had known he was in danger, and he had tried to leave a trail that would lead to justice even if he did not survive. Ranger nudged Samuel's shoulder as he finished reading, the stallion's warm breath a reminder that he was not alone in this desolate place. Samuel looked at the horse with new understanding dawning in his eyes. Ranger had not wandered onto this property by accident. The way he had led Samuel directly to the burial site, the way he seemed to recognize the significance of each discovery, suggested a connection that went beyond coincidence. Samuel walked over to where the old windmill stood creaking in the morning breeze, its rusted blades turning slowly against the bright blue sky. Ranger followed close behind, his hooves raising small clouds of dust with each step. The base of the windmill was constructed of weathered stone and crumbling mortar, a foundation that had been built to last generations. Samuel circled it slowly, looking for any sign of disturbance, any indication that Walter Hadley had hidden something there as his letter suggested. On the northern side, partially obscured by a tangle of dead brush, he found what he was looking for. A loose stone that shifted when he pressed against it, revealing a small cavity within the foundation. Inside was a metal lockbox, its surface corroded by years of exposure to the elements but still intact enough to protect whatever lay within. Samuel carried the lockbox back to the porch and used a crowbar to break the rusted lock. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept them dry through 2 decades of seasonal rains, were documents that would change everything. There were original copies of the geological surveys, notarized statements from witnesses who had seen the oil samples extracted from the property, and most damning of all, a series of photographs showing Theodore Brennan meeting with men that Samuel did not recognize, but whose body language suggested they were not engaged in legitimate business. Walter Hadley had been building a case against his partner, gathering evidence of conspiracy and fraud that would have sent Theodore Brennan to prison for the rest of his life. The question that now consumed Samuel was whether Theodore Brennan was still alive, still walking free somewhere while his victim's bones lay forgotten beneath the desert floor. And if he was alive, how would he react when he learned that the secrets of the Hadley Ranch were finally being dragged into the light? Samuel spent the next several hours researching Theodore Brennan, using the limited internet connection available on his laptop. The satellite signal was weak and unreliable, but he managed to piece together enough information to form a troubling picture. Theodore Brennan had been a prominent businessman in West Texas during the early 2000s, known for his involvement in various land deals and mineral rights transactions. His name appeared in numerous newspaper articles from that era, always described as a shrewd negotiator and a pillar of the local community. But in 2006, approximately 1 year after Walter Hadley's disappearance, Theodore had sold all his holdings in Texas and relocated to Arizona, where he had built a small empire of commercial real estate that had made him exceptionally wealthy. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Theodore had fled the area shortly after Walter's disappearance, taking with him profits that Samuel now suspected had been stolen rather than earned. A deeper search revealed that Theodore Brennan was still alive at 78 years old, living in a gated community outside Phoenix, where he was known for his charitable donations and his collection of classic automobiles. The man who had likely buried Walter Hadley alive was spending his golden years in luxury, untouched by the consequences of his crimes, while his victim's bones had lain forgotten beneath the desert floor for 2 decades. Samuel knew he needed to contact the authorities, but something made him hesitate. Small-town sheriffs in West Texas were not always equipped to handle cases involving wealthy suspects with powerful connections, and Theodore Brennan had clearly spent years cultivating exactly such connections. If Samuel went to the police with his evidence and the investigation was bungled or buried, Theodore might be warned in time to destroy whatever additional evidence existed and hire lawyers capable of creating reasonable doubt about his involvement. Samuel needed to be strategic, to ensure that when the truth finally came out, it would be impossible for Theodore Brennan to escape justice. Ranger seemed to sense his companion's inner turmoil. The Stallion had stayed close throughout the morning, occasionally pressing his nose against Samuel's arm as if offering comfort and encouragement. Samuel found himself talking to the horse, sharing his thoughts aloud in a way that he would have found embarrassing if anyone else had been present. "You knew him, did you not?" Samuel said quietly, stroking Ranger's dusty mane. "You belonged to Walter, and somehow you survived all these years waiting for someone to come along and listen to what you had to tell." The horse's dark eyes seemed to hold confirmation of this theory, and Samuel felt a chill run down his spine despite the midday heat. The connection between Ranger and Walter Hadley explained so much about the stallion's behavior. Horses could live 30 years or more under the right conditions, and Ranger appeared to be in his mid-20s despite his malnourished state. If he had been Walter's horse, he would have been a young stallion when his owner was murdered, perhaps 4 or 5 years old. The years of wandering the desert, surviving on whatever vegetation and water he could find, had taken their toll, but something had kept Ranger alive through all those harsh seasons. Perhaps it was the same instinct that had drawn him back to this property when Samuel arrived, the same loyalty that refused to let his master's death go unavenged. Samuel made his decision. Before going to the authorities, he would visit Dry Creek and learn what the locals remembered about Walter Hadley and Theodore Brennan. 20 years was a long time, but in small towns, memories ran deep, and grudges ran even deeper. Someone might know something that would strengthen his case, some detail or observation that had seemed insignificant at the time but now took on new meaning in light of what Samuel had discovered. He filled Ranger's water trough, left out extra feed, and promised the stallion he would return before nightfall. The drive into Dry Creek took 40 minutes along roads that seemed designed to test both vehicle and driver. The town itself was exactly what Samuel had expected, a cluster of aging buildings arranged around a main street that had seen better days, populated by people whose faces bore the weathered look of those who had spent their lives under the relentless Texas sun. He parked outside a diner called Rosie's and walked inside, immediately drawing the attention of every patron in the establishment. Strangers were clearly rare in Dry Creek, and Samuel's arrival generated a wave of curious stares and whispered conversations. He took a seat at the counter and ordered coffee from a waitress whose name tag identified her as Dolores. She was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that suggested she had seen more than her share of trouble over the years. When she brought his coffee, Samuel decided to take a direct approach. "I just bought the old Hadley place," he said casually, watching her reaction carefully. "Been doing some work on the property and found some interesting things buried out there." Dolores's face went pale, and her hand trembled slightly as she set down the coffee cup. "The Hadley place," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nobody's lived there since Walter went missing. Most folks around here figured he wandered off and died in the desert, but there were always rumors." She glanced around the diner, noting that several other patrons had stopped eating and were listening intently to their conversation. "Rumors about what?" Samuel prompted gently. The waitress leaned closer, lowering her voice even further. "Rumors about his partner, Theodore Brennan. Those two had some kind of falling out right before Walter disappeared. Theodore claimed they had simply dissolved their business relationship, but some people noticed things. Theodore bought a brand new truck the week after Walter went missing, paid cash for it. And there was a fire at the county records office that same month, destroyed a lot of documents related to land transactions. People talked, but nobody could prove anything, and Theodore had friends in high places." Samuel absorbed this information with a growing sense of vindication. His suspicions were not unfounded. The community had harbored doubts about Theodore Brennan for 20 years, but had lacked the evidence to act on them. Now Samuel had that evidence, buried in a cellar and hidden beneath a windmill, waiting for someone brave enough to bring it into the light. Dolores's information proved to be just the beginning. As word spread through the diner that a stranger was asking questions about Walter Hadley and Theodore Brennan, other patrons began approaching Samuel's spot at the counter, each one carrying a fragment of memory that contributed to the larger picture. An elderly rancher named Earl remembered seeing Theodore's truck parked near the Hadley property late at night, in the weeks before Walter's disappearance, its headlights cutting through the darkness at hours when no legitimate business would be conducted. A retired schoolteacher named Margaret recalled that Walter had seemed increasingly paranoid in his final months, refusing to discuss his affairs with anyone and keeping his curtains drawn even during the day. The most significant testimony came from a man who introduced himself simply as Hector, a weathered farmhand in his 60s who claimed to have worked for Walter Hadley during the summer of 2004. Hector spoke slowly and deliberately, choosing his words with the care of someone who had carried a burden for far too long and was finally ready to set it down. Walter found something on his land that summer, Hector said, his calloused hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee. He hired some men from Houston to come out and do tests, and after they left, he was a changed man, excited at first, talking about how everything was going to be different, how he was finally going to have the life he deserved. But then Theodore got involved, and Walter started looking over his shoulder constantly. Samuel asked Hector what he knew about the relationship between Walter and Theodore, and the old farmhand's expression darkened. Theodore was always smooth, Hector explained, the kind of man who could sell you your own boots and make you thank him for the opportunity. He convinced Walter that he needed a partner to handle the business side of things, someone who knew how to negotiate with the big oil companies. Walter trusted him because they had known each other for years, went to the same church, attended the same community events. But I saw the way Theodore looked at that land after the geologist left. It was the look of a man who had found something he wanted and did not intend to share. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the diner's door opening, and a hush fell over the establishment as a young man in a sheriff's deputy uniform walked inside. He was perhaps 30 years old, with a lean build and sharp eyes that immediately fixed on Samuel with obvious suspicion. "Deputy Marcus Wells," he announced, approaching the counter with the confident stride of someone accustomed to authority. "I hear you have been asking a lot of questions about old history, stranger. Mind telling me what your interest is in Walter Hadley?" Samuel considered his options carefully. He had planned to approach the authorities on his own terms, with all his evidence organized and his case clearly presented, but this unexpected encounter forced him to adapt. "My name is Samuel Thornton," he replied calmly. "I recently purchased the Hadley property, and during excavation work I discovered human remains that I believe belonged to the previous owner. I was planning to report my findings to the proper authorities once I had gathered enough information to ensure a thorough investigation." The deputy's expression shifted from suspicion to shock, and Samuel noticed that every person in the diner had stopped breathing, waiting to hear what would come next. "Human remains," Deputy Wells repeated slowly. "You are telling me you found a body on the Hadley place?" Samuel nodded and proceeded to describe his discovery in clinical terms, omitting for now the documents and photographs that implicated Theodore Brennan. He wanted to gauge the deputy's reaction, to determine whether this young lawman could be trusted with evidence that pointed toward a wealthy and well-connected suspect. Deputy Wells listened without interruption, his face growing increasingly grave as Samuel detailed the position of the skeleton, the evidence of prolonged survival, and the personal effects that identified the victim as Walter Hadley. When Samuel finished, the deputy was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight with emotion that seemed to go beyond professional concern. "Walter Hadley was my grandfather's best friend," he finally said. "I grew up hearing stories about how he just vanished one day, how my grandfather spent months searching the desert hoping to find some trace of him. Grandpa died 5 years ago, still wondering what happened to Walter. And now you are telling me he was buried on his own property this whole time. The personal connection changed everything." Deputy Wells was not just a local lawman following procedure. He was someone with a stake in seeing justice done, someone who had inherited the mystery of Walter Hadley's disappearance as part of his family history. Samuel made a decision that would prove crucial to the events that followed. He told the deputy about the documents hidden beneath the windmill, about the letter to Eleanor, and about the evidence pointing toward Theodore Brennan as the man responsible for Walter's death. The deputy's eyes widened with each revelation, and when Samuel finished, Marcus Wells looked like a man who had just been handed both a gift and a terrible burden. "We need to do this right," the deputy said firmly. "Theodore Brennan may be an old man now, but he still has money and influence. If we go after him without an airtight case, his lawyers will tear us apart, and he will walk free. I have a contact in the Texas Rangers who specializes in cold cases. She is honest and thorough, and she does not care how rich or connected a suspect might be. Let me bring her in on this before we make any official moves." Samuel agreed, recognizing that he had found an ally whose local knowledge and law enforcement connections would be invaluable in the days ahead. As they shook hands and exchanged contact information, Samuel noticed that the other patrons in the diner were watching with expressions that ranged from hope to fear. 20 years of silence was about to end, and everyone in Dry Creek understood that the truth, once unleashed, would change their community forever. The drive back to the ranch felt longer than before, weighted with the significance of what had transpired. When Samuel finally pulled up to the old house, Ranger was waiting by the fence, his ears pricked forward as if he had been anxiously awaiting his companion's return. 3 days passed before Texas Ranger Captain Elena Vasquez arrived at the Hadley Ranch. She came alone, driving an unmarked truck that kicked up dust along the winding road just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. Samuel watched her approach from the porch, Ranger standing beside him with the alertness of a sentinel guarding sacred ground. Captain Vasquez was a woman in her late 40s, with silver streaking through her dark hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once while giving nothing away. She moved with the confident efficiency of someone who had spent decades pursuing justice in places where justice was often the last thing powerful people wanted. Deputy Wells had spoken highly of her during their conversations over the past few days, describing her as the most tenacious investigator he had ever encountered. She had closed cases that other officers had abandoned as unsolvable, brought down criminals who believed their wealth and connections made them untouchable, and earned a reputation throughout Texas as someone who could not be bought, intimidated, or discouraged. When she stepped out of her truck and surveyed the property with those penetrating eyes, Samuel understood immediately why Marcus had insisted on bringing her into the investigation. Captain Vasquez shook Samuel's hand with a firm grip and introduced herself in a voice that was businesslike but not unfriendly. "Deputy Wells has briefed me on what you have found," she said, her gaze moving from Samuel to Ranger and then to the excavation site visible in the distance. "I have been tracking Theodore Brennan for nearly 15 years, ever since I started noticing patterns in land transactions across West Texas that suggested systematic fraud. He has always managed to stay one step ahead of investigation, but what you have discovered here might finally be enough to bring him to justice." Samuel led her first to the cellar, where the skeleton of Walter Hadley remained undisturbed pending official forensic examination. Captain Vasquez descended the rope with practiced ease and spent nearly an hour documenting the scene, taking photographs and making notes in a small leather-bound journal that she carried in her jacket pocket. When she emerged, her expression was grim but determined. "This was not just murder," she said quietly. "This was torture. Whoever did this wanted Walter Hadley to suffer, wanted him to die slowly with the knowledge that no one would ever find him. That level of cruelty suggests either personal hatred or the need to extract information before death." The documents from beneath the windmill proved even more compelling to Captain Vasquez than the physical evidence of the murder. She spread them across the kitchen table inside the ranch house, studying each page with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient texts. Samuel watched as her eyes moved rapidly across the geological surveys, the mineral rights certificates, and the damning photographs of Theodore Brennan meeting with unknown associates. When she reached Walter's letter to his sister Eleanor, she read it 3 times before setting it down with a heavy sigh. "Walter Hadley knew he was in danger," she said, almost to herself. He tried to protect himself by gathering evidence and hiding it where someone might eventually find it. But he underestimated how far Theodore Brennan was willing to go. Samuel asked if she had ever encountered Eleanor, Walter's sister, during her previous investigations. Captain Vasquez shook her head sadly. Eleanor Hadley died in 2012. Cancer. She spent the last years of her life trying to find out what happened to her brother, hiring private investigators and writing letters to every law enforcement agency in Texas. Nobody took her seriously because there was no body, no evidence of foul play. Just an old rancher who had supposedly wandered off into the desert. The injustice of it weighed heavily on Samuel. Walter Hadley had been murdered for his land, his body hidden by a man who went on to live in luxury, while the victim's family suffered in ignorance. Eleanor had died never knowing the truth, never seeing justice served for her brother's killing. It was a story that repeated itself throughout history, the powerful escaping consequences while the innocent paid the price. But knowing that did not make it any easier to accept, because this time Samuel had the chance to change the ending. Captain Vasquez outlined her plan for the investigation over coffee that evening. The forensic team would arrive within 48 hours to properly excavate the cellar and recover Walter's remains. DNA testing would confirm the identity, though the personal effects left little doubt. Simultaneously, she would begin the process of obtaining warrants to examine Theodore Brennan's financial records from 2004 through 2006, looking for evidence of the fraudulent land transfers that Walter had suspected. The photographs from the satchel would be analyzed to identify the other men present, potentially revealing co-conspirators who might be willing to testify in exchange for reduced charges. But we need to move carefully, she cautioned. Theodore Brennan has had 20 years to cover his tracks and build defenses. He has lawyers on retainer who specialize in making evidence disappear and witnesses recant. If he gets wind that we are coming for him before we have our case fully assembled, he will use every resource at his disposal to obstruct the investigation. Samuel understood the need for discretion, but he also felt an urgency that grew stronger with each passing day. Ranger had waited 2 decades for someone to discover the truth about his master's death, and Samuel did not want to make the faithful Stallion wait any longer than necessary. That night, after Captain Vasquez had departed to begin her preparations, Samuel sat with Ranger beneath a sky filled with more stars than he had ever seen in his life. The desert darkness was absolute, broken only by the faint glow of his porch light and the distant twinkle of Dry Creek's scattered buildings. He spoke to the horse in low tones, sharing his hopes and fears about the investigation ahead. Ranger listened as he always did, his large eyes reflecting the starlight, his presence a comfort that Samuel had come to depend upon more than he would have thought possible just weeks ago. "We are going to get him," Samuel promised, stroking the stallion's neck. "Theodore Brennan is going to answer for what he did to Walter, and everyone will finally know the truth about what happened here." Ranger nickered softly in response, and Samuel could have sworn the sound carried a note of approval, of gratitude, of trust in the man who had finally heard what the starving stallion had been trying to tell the world for 20 long years. The forensic team arrived 2 days later, just as Captain Vasquez had promised. They came in a convoy of 3 vehicles, carrying equipment and expertise that transformed the quiet ranch into a hive of scientific activity. Samuel watched from a distance as technicians in white suits descended into the cellar, their movements careful and methodical as they documented every detail of Walter Hadley's final resting place. Ranger stayed close to Samuel throughout the process, his ears flattening against his head whenever strangers approached the excavation site, as if protecting the memory of his master, even as the physical evidence of his death was finally being brought into the light. The lead forensic examiner, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Raymond Chen, confirmed what Samuel had suspected from the beginning. The victim had survived for an extended period after being trapped in the cellar, perhaps as long as 2 weeks based on the evidence of attempted escape and the consumption of stored supplies. The cause of death was most likely dehydration and starvation, a slow and agonizing end that spoke to the cruelty of whoever had imprisoned him there. Dr. Chen also noted defensive wounds on the skeletal remains, fractures to the forearms consistent with someone trying to protect themselves from an attack. Walter Hadley had fought for his life before being forced into that underground tomb. While the forensic team worked at the ranch, Captain Vasquez was pursuing the paper trail that Theodore Brennan had left behind. Her initial findings were promising but complicated. Land records showed that ownership of the Hadley property had transferred to a shell company called Brennan Holdings just 3 months after Walter's disappearance, based on documents that bore Walter's signature but were dated after he was already dead. The fraud was obvious to anyone who knew the truth, but proving it in court would require demonstrating that Walter could not have signed those papers, which meant establishing a precise timeline of his death. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Captain Vasquez discovered that the Hadley property was not the only land Theodore Brennan had acquired under suspicious circumstances. Over the course of 2 decades, he had accumulated mineral rights to nearly a dozen properties across West Texas, each acquisition following a similar pattern. Elderly or isolated landowners who died or disappeared under unclear circumstances, followed by rapid transfers of ownership to shell companies that eventually led back to Brennan. The scope of his crimes was staggering, suggesting not a single murder but a systematic campaign of theft and violence that had enriched him beyond measure. Samuel struggled to process this information when Captain Vasquez shared it during one of her visits to the ranch. The idea that Walter Hadley had been just one victim among many, that Theodore Brennan had built his fortune on a foundation of bodies and stolen dreams, filled him with a cold fury that he had never experienced before. "How did he get away with it for so long?" Samuel demanded, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "How did no one notice what was happening?" Captain Vasquez's expression was sympathetic but honest. "People noticed," she replied. "But noticing is not the same as proving." Brennan was careful, patient, and ruthless. He targeted people who were vulnerable and isolated, people whose disappearances could be explained by natural causes or simple misfortune. He cultivated relationships with local officials who were either corrupt or simply willing to look the other way, and he had enough money to make problems disappear before they became serious threats. Until now. The break they needed came from an unexpected source. One of the men in the photographs from Walter's satchel was identified as Roberto Mendez, a former ranch hand who had worked for Theodore Brennan during the relevant time period. Roberto was now 72 years old, living in a nursing home in El Paso, and according to his medical records, he was suffering from terminal lung cancer with only months to live. Captain Vasquez traveled to El Paso to interview him, hoping that a dying man might be willing to unburden his conscience before meeting his maker. She returned 3 days later with a recorded confession that would prove crucial to the case. Roberto Mendez, facing his own mortality, had decided to tell the truth about what he had witnessed 20 years ago. He described how Theodore Brennan had recruited him and 2 other men to help deal with Walter Hadley, promising them each $10,000 in cash for a night's work. They had surprised Walter at his ranch, beaten him when he resisted, and then forced him down into the cellar that he himself had built as a storm shelter. Theodore had personally sealed the entrance, covering it with soil and debris, while Walter screamed and pounded on the wooden ceiling above. Roberto's confession also revealed what had happened to Ranger. The Stallion had been Walter's pride and joy, a horse he had raised from a foal and trained with his own hands. On the night of the murder, Ranger had been locked in the barn, and Theodore had ordered his men to kill the animal along with any other witnesses to their crime. But Roberto, despite his participation in Walter's death, had drawn the line at killing an innocent horse. He had released Ranger into the desert instead, hoping the stallion would either die naturally or find his way to another ranch where someone might take him in. The fact that Ranger had survived for 20 years, had somehow found his way back to the Hadley property, seemed to Roberto like divine judgment for his sins. Samuel shared this revelation with Ranger that evening, sitting beside the stallion in the fading light. "You survived because someone showed you mercy," he said softly, running his fingers through the horse's mane. "And you spent all those years waiting, somehow knowing that eventually someone would come who would listen to what you had to tell." Ranger pressed his head against Samuel's chest, and for a long moment, man and horse stood together in silence, united by a bond that had been forged in the pursuit of truth and justice. The case against Theodore Brennan was nearly complete. Roberto Mendez's confession, combined with the forensic evidence from the cellar and the documents from beneath the windmill, created an overwhelming picture of guilt. Captain Vasquez obtained arrest warrants not only for murder, but for fraud, conspiracy, and a dozen other charges that would ensure Theodore Brennan spent whatever remained of his life behind bars. The day of reckoning was finally approaching, and Samuel felt a mixture of anticipation and solemnity as he prepared to witness the conclusion of a story that had begun long before he ever set foot on this cursed and blessed piece of land. The arrest of Theodore Brennan took place on a Tuesday morning in late October, exactly 6 weeks after Samuel had first discovered Walter Hadley's remains beneath the desert floor. Captain Vasquez had coordinated with federal authorities to ensure that Brennan would have no opportunity to flee or destroy evidence, and the operation was executed with military precision. A team of agents arrived at his gated community in Phoenix before dawn, surrounding his sprawling mansion while helicopters hovered overhead to prevent any attempt at escape. Theodore Brennan, who had lived for 2 decades believing himself untouchable, was awakened by the sound of battering rams splintering his front door. Samuel was not present for the arrest, but Captain Vasquez called him immediately afterward to share the news. He answered his phone while standing in the exact spot where he had first discovered the entrance to Walter's tomb, Ranger grazing peacefully nearby as if this were any ordinary morning. "Brennan is in custody," Captain Vasquez reported, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction that she rarely allowed herself to express. He tried to claim he knew nothing about any of it, that he was being framed by business rivals who wanted to destroy his reputation. But when we showed him Roberto Mendez's confession and the photographs from Walter's satchel, he stopped talking and asked for his lawyer. The news spread quickly through Dry Creek and the surrounding communities. For the first time in 20 years, people felt safe discussing what they had long suspected about Theodore Brennan, sharing stories and observations that they had kept to themselves out of fear or uncertainty. Deputy Marcus Wells became something of a local hero, the lawman who had helped bring justice to his grandfather's best friend, and Samuel noticed that the young man stood a little taller whenever he walked through town. The burden of unanswered questions that had weighed on this community for so long was finally beginning to lift. Samuel received an unexpected visitor 3 days after the arrest. A woman in her 60s arrived at the ranch in a rental car, her eyes red from crying and her hands trembling as she introduced herself as Catherine Hadley, Walter's niece and Eleanor's daughter. She had learned about the discovery from news reports and had flown immediately from California, desperate to see the place where her uncle had spent his final days and to meet the man who had finally uncovered the truth about his death. Samuel welcomed her into the ranch house and spent hours answering her questions, sharing everything he had learned about Walter's life, his discovery, and the betrayal that had led to his murder. Catherine brought photographs of Walter that Samuel had never seen, images of a smiling man with kind eyes and weathered hands posing with horses and standing proudly in front of the ranch that he had built with his own labor. One photograph in particular caught Samuel's attention. It showed Walter with a young chestnut stallion, his arm draped affectionately over the horse's neck, while both man and animal looked directly at the camera with expressions of mutual trust and affection. "That was Ranger," Catherine confirmed, wiping tears from her cheeks. Uncle Walter raised him from a foal, spent hours every day training him and caring for him. He used to say that Ranger understood him better than any person ever could. Samuel led Catherine outside to meet the horse that had survived 20 years in the desert, waiting for someone to discover what had happened to his master. When Ranger saw Catherine approaching, something remarkable happened. The stallion's ears pricked forward, and he moved toward her with an urgency that Samuel had never witnessed before. Catherine froze, her hand rising to her mouth as she watched the horse approach, and when Ranger finally stood before her, he lowered his great head and pressed it gently against her chest. The gesture was so tender, so filled with recognition and grief, that both Catherine and Samuel found themselves weeping openly. "He remembers," Catherine whispered, her arms wrapping around Ranger's neck. "He remembers our family, remembers being loved." Samuel watched this reunion between a woman and an animal who shared a connection to a man they had both lost, and he understood that some bonds transcended time and circumstance, that love could endure even through decades of separation and suffering. Ranger had carried Walter's memory across 20 years of desert wandering, and now he was sharing that memory with the family who had never stopped wondering what had happened to their beloved uncle and brother. Catherine stayed at the ranch for a week, helping Samuel organize Walter's personal effects and making arrangements for a proper burial. The forensic team had completed their work, and Walter's remains were released to his family for interment in the small cemetery outside Dry Creek, where generations of local ranchers had been laid to rest. The funeral was a community event, attended by dozens of people who had known Walter or who simply wanted to pay their respects to a man whose story had touched their hearts. Deputy Wells delivered a eulogy on behalf of his late grandfather, speaking of friendship and loyalty and the enduring power of truth. Ranger was present at the funeral, standing at the edge of the gathering with Samuel holding his lead rope. When the time came to lower Walter's casket into the ground, the stallion let out a long, mournful cry that echoed across the cemetery and brought fresh tears to the eyes of everyone present. It was a sound of farewell, of release, of a vigil finally ended after 2 decades of patient waiting. Samuel stroked Ranger's neck and whispered words of comfort, promising the horse that Walter's memory would be honored and his killer would face justice. The legal proceedings against Theodore Brennan moved forward with remarkable speed, driven by the overwhelming evidence that Captain Vasquez had assembled. Brennan's lawyers attempted various strategies to delay or dismiss the case, but each effort was thwarted by the meticulous documentation that Walter himself had created and hidden beneath the windmill. The geological surveys, the photographs, the letter to Eleanor, and Roberto Mendez's deathbed confession formed an unbreakable chain of evidence that no amount of money or legal maneuvering could overcome. As autumn gave way to winter, Samuel found himself settling into life at the Hadley Ranch with a sense of purpose he had never expected to find. The property that no one had wanted, the cursed land that real estate agents had tried to sell for 20 years, had become his home. And the starving stallion that had wandered onto his property had become his closest companion, a living reminder that some stories, no matter how long they take to unfold, eventually find their way to justice. The trial of Theodore Brennan began in January, held in a federal courthouse in Austin, where the case had been transferred to avoid any lingering influence the defendant might have wielded in his home territory. Samuel made the 4-hour drive to attend the opening statements, sitting in the gallery alongside Catherine Hadley, Deputy Marcus Wells, and dozens of others whose lives had been touched by this case. The courtroom was packed with journalists and spectators, all eager to witness the downfall of a man who had spent 2 decades enjoying the fruits of murder and fraud, while his victims lay forgotten beneath the desert sand. Theodore Brennan looked nothing like the powerful figure Samuel had imagined during his months of investigation. The man who sat at the defense table was frail and diminished, his expensive suit hanging loosely on a frame that had shrunk with age and stress. His eyes, once described by Hector as calculating and cold, now darted nervously around the courtroom, as if searching for an escape that did not exist. The confidence that had allowed him to commit such terrible crimes and sleep soundly for 20 years had evaporated in the face of overwhelming evidence and the relentless pursuit of Captain Elena Vasquez. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Witness after witness took the stand to describe Theodore Brennan's pattern of predatory behavior, the way he had identified vulnerable landowners and systematically stripped them of their property and their lives. Roberto Mendez's recorded confession was played for the jury, his raspy voice filling the courtroom as he described the night they had beaten Walter Hadley and sealed him in his own cellar. Several jurors wept openly as they listened, and even the defense attorneys seemed shaken by the brutality of the crimes their client had committed. Samuel was called to testify on the third day of the trial, asked to describe his discovery of the cellar and the remains within. He spoke clearly and precisely, drawing on his scientific training to present the facts without embellishment or emotion. But when the prosecutor asked him to describe Ranger's behavior, the way the starving stallion had led him directly to the burial site, Samuel's voice wavered for the first time. "That horse waited 20 years for someone to listen," he said, looking directly at the jury. "He survived alone in the desert, came back to the place where his master had died and refused to rest until the truth was uncovered. If that is not loyalty, if that is not love, then I do not know what those words mean." The defense attempted to discredit Samuel's testimony, suggesting that he had fabricated evidence to increase the value of his newly purchased property. But the forensic evidence was irrefutable, and the documents from beneath the windmill bore authenticating marks that proved they had been created decades before Samuel ever heard of the Hadley Ranch. Theodore Brennan's lead attorney, a high-priced specialist from Houston who had never lost a murder case, looked increasingly desperate as each of his strategies crumbled under the weight of truth. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. Theodore Brennan showed no emotion as the foreman read the decision, but Samuel noticed that the old man's hands were shaking uncontrollably beneath the defense table. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following month, though everyone in the courtroom knew that Brennan would spend whatever remained of his life behind bars. Justice, delayed for 2 decades, had finally arrived. Samuel returned to the ranch that evening, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. The legal battle was essentially over, but the emotional journey was far from complete. He found Ranger waiting by the fence as always, the stallion's ears perking forward at the sound of Samuel's truck approaching. Samuel parked and walked over to his companion, pressing his forehead against Ranger's warm neck and breathing in the familiar scent of horse and desert dust. "We did it," he whispered. "We got him. Walter can rest now, and so can you." The weeks that followed brought unexpected developments that transformed Samuel's understanding of why fate had led him to the Hadley Ranch. Captain Vasquez informed him that the geological surveys from Walter's satchel had been verified by independent experts, confirming that the property did indeed sit atop significant oil deposits. As the legal owner of the land and its mineral rights, Samuel stood to become extraordinarily wealthy if he chose to develop those resources. It was a strange irony that the same discovery which had cost Walter Hadley his life was now being offered to the man who had avenged his death. Samuel spent long hours contemplating what to do with this unexpected fortune. He walked the property with Ranger at his side, remembering how the land had looked when he first arrived, abandoned, cursed, unwanted by anyone who knew its history. Now it represented possibility, the chance to build something meaningful from the ashes of tragedy. Catherine Hadley helped him make the decision during one of her visits to the ranch. Uncle Walter dreamed of using that oil money to help people, she told him. He wanted to create scholarships for young people from rural communities, to fund research into sustainable ranching practices, to make a difference in the world. Maybe you could honor his memory by fulfilling those dreams. The idea resonated deeply with Samuel. He had spent his career helping corporations extract wealth from the earth, but he had rarely considered what that wealth could accomplish in the hands of someone committed to doing good. With Catherine's guidance and the assistance of lawyers who specialized in charitable foundations, Samuel established the Walter Hadley Memorial Trust, dedicating a substantial portion of the oil revenues to causes that Walter himself had cared about. Scholarships were created, research grants were funded, and a wildlife sanctuary was established on a portion of the ranch where animals could roam free, protected from the cruelties of the world. Ranger became the unofficial mascot of the foundation, his story inspiring donations from across the country as people learned about the loyal Stallion who had waited 20 years to bring his master's killer to justice. Samuel had professional photographs taken of Ranger, images that captured the nobility and resilience of an animal who had survived against impossible odds, and these photographs were featured in the foundation's promotional materials. The starving horse that Samuel had found dying by the water trough had become a symbol of hope, proof that patience and loyalty could ultimately triumph over greed and violence. Theodore Brennan was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on a cold February morning, exactly 8 months after Samuel had first purchased the property that no one else wanted. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair and decades of experience on the bench, delivered her remarks with a gravity that silenced every whisper in the packed courtroom. "You stole more than land and money," she said, her eyes fixed on the frail defendant who sat slumped in his wheelchair. "You stole lives, you stole futures, you stole the peace of families who spent years wondering what had happened to their loved ones. No sentence can undo that damage, but I can ensure that you never harm another soul for whatever time remains to you." Samuel watched as guards wheeled Theodore Brennan out of the courtroom, the man's head bowed in defeat. His empire of lies finally collapsed around him. Catherine Hadley sat beside Samuel, her hand gripping his tightly as tears streamed down her face. It was over. After 20 years of uncertainty, 20 years of unanswered questions and sleepless nights, the Hadley family finally had closure. Walter's killer would die behind bars, stripped of the wealth and prestige he had accumulated through murder and fraud, remembered not as a pillar of the community, but as a monster who had preyed upon the vulnerable. The drive back to Dry Creek felt different from any journey Samuel had made before. The desert landscape, once so alien and forbidding, now seemed familiar and welcoming. He had arrived in West Texas as a stranger seeking opportunity, a geologist looking for what lay beneath the surface. He was returning as something entirely different, a guardian of memory, a seeker of justice, and the unexpected heir to a legacy that stretched back generations. The Hadley Ranch was no longer a cursed property that no one wanted. It was a place of healing, a sanctuary where the wounds of the past could finally begin to close. Ranger was waiting at the fence when Samuel's truck appeared on the horizon, the stallion's chestnut coat gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. The years of careful feeding and veterinary attention had transformed him from a starving wraith into a healthy and dignified animal, though his age was beginning to show in the gray around his muzzle and the deliberate slowness of his movements. Samuel parked the truck and walked over to his companion, wrapping his arms around the horse's neck in an embrace that had become their daily ritual. "We did what we set out to do," Samuel murmured. "Walter can rest now, and you have earned your peace." The months that followed were the happiest of Samuel's life. He settled into the rhythm of ranch work, rising with the sun and spending his days caring for the animals that had begun to fill the property. The wildlife sanctuary attracted creatures from across the region, horses and donkeys, and even a few cattle that had been rescued from neglectful owners. Samuel hired local young people to help manage the growing operation, providing jobs and purpose to a community that had struggled economically for years. The Walter Hadley Memorial Trust funded improvements to the local school, built a new community center in Dry Creek, and sponsored dozens of scholarships for students who dreamed of escaping poverty through education. Ranger remained Samuel's constant companion through all of it. They walked the property together every morning, the man and the horse moving in comfortable silence through landscapes that held no more secrets. Samuel often found himself talking to Ranger about his plans and hopes, sharing thoughts that he would have been embarrassed to express to any human listener. The stallion always seemed to understand, his dark eyes reflecting a wisdom that went beyond animal intelligence. Their bond had been forged in the pursuit of truth, and it had deepened into something that Samuel could only describe as friendship. The end came peacefully, as such things sometimes do. Ranger passed away on a spring morning 3 years after Samuel first found him starving by the water trough, his great heart finally giving out as he lay in the soft grass of the pasture he had come to call home. Samuel was beside him when it happened, stroking his mane and whispering words of gratitude and love. The stallion closed his eyes with a sigh that seemed to carry 23 years of waiting, of wandering, of loyal devotion to a master who had been taken too soon. And then he was gone, leaving Samuel alone with memories that would last a lifetime. They buried Ranger beside Walter Hadley in the small cemetery outside Dry Creek, a decision that required special permission but that no one in the community opposed. A simple stone marked the grave, bearing an inscription that Samuel had composed himself. Here lies Ranger, faithful unto death and beyond, who waited 20 years to bring justice to his friend. The funeral was attended by nearly everyone in town, and Samuel noticed that even the toughest ranchers wiped tears from their weathered faces as the stallion was lowered into the earth beside the man he had loved. Samuel continued his work at the ranch for many years afterward, building the sanctuary into a nationally recognized refuge for abandoned and abused animals. He never married, never felt the need for human companionship beyond the friendships he had formed in Dry Creek. The memory of Ranger sustained him through lonely nights and difficult decisions, a reminder that loyalty and patience could accomplish miracles that seemed impossible. He often sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the desert and remembering the starving stallion who had shown him what truly mattered in life. The story of Samuel Thornton and Ranger became legend in West Texas, passed down through generations as an example of how love and determination could triumph over greed and cruelty. Children grew up hearing about the horse who waited 20 years to avenge his master, and the stranger who listened when no one else would. Some said the tale was exaggerated, embellished by time and retelling, but those who had witnessed it knew the truth. In a world that often rewards the ruthless and punishes the innocent, one man and one horse had proven that justice, though delayed, could never be permanently denied. If this story touched your heart, I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment rating this story from 1 to 10 and let me know where in the world you are watching from. If you enjoy emotional stories about the incredible bonds between humans and animals, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and remember, sometimes the greatest treasures are not buried beneath the earth but standing right beside us, waiting patiently for us to see them.